Opening the diagonal for the queen and king's bishop immediately claims central space. Instantly, black sparks a fierce Sicilian battle, denying white's central dominance and setting up a dynamic, unbalanced game. Developing a knight toward the center immediately contests black's Sicilian setup and prepares for pawn advances. Opening the path for the queen and bishop, but potentially weakening dark squares, this choice embraces a solid, less combative setup. Opening the center immediately challenges black's pawn structure and offers immediate piece play. Black opens a diagonal for their queen and allows white to centralize a pawn, a common trait in this Sicilian variation. Opening the knight to this central square stakes a claim for the initiative and creates immediate pressure. Developing the knight to a central square, this move logically strengthens the pawn center and prepares for castling, all while challenging white's central knight. Preparing a fianchetto, this move sacrifices queenside space for a kingside pawn chain, aiming for long-term influence. Unveiling the bishop to this active diagonal immediately contests central control and seeks to exploit white's kingside development. Repositioning the knight to b3 skillfully clears the d4 square for another piece, while simultaneously eyeing the c5 bishop and creating a subtle but persistent pressure along the a5-d8 diagonal, forcing black to consider their development options carefully. Solidifying the kingside, the bishop now finds a secure haven, preparing for castling and reinforcing the pawn chain's defense. Opening up the bishop's diagonal toward the kingside now prepares for castling and adds pressure to the central pawns, a solid developing step. Developing the knight to its natural square, the knight establishes a solid defensive presence and prepares to challenge white's queenside pawns by potentially swinging to d5, while also freeing the d-pawn for future advancement. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking him away behind a wall of pawns signifies white's commitment to building a solid foundation, preparing for a potential kingside assault, or simply reinforcing his central ambitions after the initial skirmishes. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the queen's bishop establishes a robust defensive setup. Solidifying the pawn center while restricting black's knight development opens avenues for white's pieces to find more active squares. Shifting the knight to the edge might seem passive, but it cleverly redirects pressure, aiming to disrupt white's central control by creating potential tactical skirmishes around the kingside and eyeing unexplored diagonals. Shifting the queen to e2 prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, while also clearing the d1 square for a rook, hinting at future central control or an aggressive sortie down the open file. Challenging the central pawn chain, the queen now eyes the d4 knight and prepares to support future pawn pushes on the queen side, potentially aiming for b6 to contest white's bishop's influence. Rescuing the knight from its precarious outpost on b3 and preparing to swing it over to the kingside aims to bolster white's eventual attacking potential. Developing the bishop to support a potential b6 advance and contest the a8-h1 diagonal adds solidifying presence, while also preparing to challenge white's knight on b3 and potentially reroute the bishop to a more active square should circumstances allow. A subtle repositioning, this bishop now eyes the kingside diagonal, preparing for a potential kingside attack while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn chain. Securing the open c-file with the rook is a proactive step, challenging white's control and preparing for potential advances along this important artery. Preparing to contest the open c-file, this action neatly untangles the queen's rook from its initial defensive posture, creating active possibilities and subtly pressuring black's queenside structure by eyeing potential weaknesses around the uncastled king. Preparing to expand kingside influence, black's pawn push subtly frees the queen's diagonal and sets the stage for queenside counterplay. Stepping onto b5, the knight immediately injects tension into black's queenside, forcing a reaction and probing for weaknesses around the c7 square. A strategic retreat, rerouting the queen to a less exposed square. It prepares to solidify the queenside pawn structure and potentially support a rook lift via the b-file, avoiding the immediate tactical skirmishes white seems to be instigating. The rook now occupies the central d-file, a critical artery of the board, setting the stage for potential pressure against black's queenside pawn structure should the center open. The king finds a more secure haven, tucking away behind a nascent pawn shield after white's aggressive knights signaled their intent to swarm. Suddenly, the knight, previously confined to the queenside, infiltrates the central battlefield, immediately contesting crucial squares and forcing black to reconsider their defensive posture. Reinforcing the center and preparing for pawn breaks feels like the natural next step, aiming to unlock the d-file and potentially challenge white's knight on b5. Embracing a flexible pawn structure, white's bishop now finds a more dynamic outpost, preparing to influence the queenside and potentially support a future queenside pawn advance, all while keeping a watchful eye on the central squares and maintaining a solid defensive shield around the king. Black's bishop on a4 now directly eyes the white queen and also prepares to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the c2 and b3 squares. Re-establishing the rook on its most natural open file after the prior maneuvering, white aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances on the king side, while also keeping an eye on the d6 pawn which black might consider defending with g6 later. Challenging white's knight on b5 and seeking to disrupt its influence, this pawn advance aims to gain space on the queenside and create potential tactical opportunities. Unleashing the knight from its initial outpost, white aims to reroute this piece towards a more active square, potentially the c2 pawn. This maneuver seeks to exploit the slight disorganization on black's queenside, where the a4 bishop, while active, might become a target for future pressure. The long-term goal is to create more harmonious piece placement, perhaps preparing a kingside initiative by reinforcing the f2 pawn and freeing up the g2 bishop for more direct attacking duties. The knight's journey back into play is a deliberate strategic gamble, trading immediate central presence for future attacking potential, a classic positional trade-off. Solidifying the bishop's retreat and preparing for potential piece maneuvering, this placement on e8 also offers a safe haven, while the d7 bishop finds a more active post elsewhere. Unlocking queenside space, white nudges forward, aiming to contest the open c-file and potentially develop a more active rook later, while also supporting the pawn that might advance to b4, a maneuver that could restrict black's minor pieces and offer a new avenue for assault. A fascinating shift in black's strategy emerges as the knight redirects from the kingside, a maneuver hinting at a desire to contest the central light squares or perhaps reposition for a queenside initiative. This redeployment, while seemingly passive on the surface, could be the precursor to a more active plan, aiming to unbalance white's carefully constructed pawn structure and create new avenues of attack. Consider the long-term implications for pawn breaks and the future control of key diagonals. Unleashing the f-pawn signals a direct assault on black's kingside, aiming to shatter the pawn shield protecting the black monarch and open lines for white's pieces. This aggressive maneuver sacrifices pawn structure for potential initiative, creating a dynamic imbalance. The ambition here is to force open the f-file, possibly leading to a battery of queen and rook against the weakened king. However, this also leaves white's own king somewhat exposed, demanding careful follow-up. Black's knight embarks on a curious journey, seeking refuge from white's advancing pawn storm and eyeing a more active central square, though its repositioning temporarily neglects the queenside development and potentially creates a weakness on the dark squares, as white's bishop on g2 now enjoys an unobstructed view. Opening up the file is a significant strategic choice, aiming to exploit the open lines and activate the queen's rook. A well-timed knight repositioning often creates new attacking avenues, and this particular maneuver is designed to strengthen the central control while preparing for potential pawn pushes on the king side. The intention here is to prepare a reallocation of forces, eyeing a more active role for pieces that have been somewhat passive. Shifting the knight to a more aggressive square signals an intention to disrupt black's solid structure and create threats on the queen side or in the center. This move is a subtle yet important step in establishing dominance over key diagonals and files, a classic strategy to build up pressure. It's a calculated risk, gambling on the ability to exploit the created space before black can fully consolidate. The focus shifts to creating an imbalance, forcing black to react to new threats rather than pursuing their own plans. A clear sign of white's intent to initiate more dynamic play, moving away from the positional buildup towards active engagement. Pivoting the bishop to f6 initiates a quiet repositioning, aiming to reinforce the d6 pawn and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the king side, while simultaneously developing a more active role for the piece. Safeguarding the king's escape route becomes paramount now, moving him from the diagonal targeting his current square and opening up a potential retreat to h2. Reclaiming the knight from its passive outpost on a3, black introduces dynamism to the queen side, aiming to challenge white's control over the c5 square and potentially open lines for future action. This maneuver signals a shift in black's strategy, moving from a defensive setup to a more proactive stance, seeking to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and exploit any positional weaknesses. The knight's new position on c5 actively eyes key central squares and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges that could alter the complexion of the game. The bishop now eyeballs the g7 pawn, potentially preparing a future advance or creating pressure along that diagonal should the opportunity arise. This maneuver offers a welcome retreat for the bishop, redeploying it to a more passive, yet defensively sound, square. It cleverly avoids immediate confrontation with the knight on b5, subtly influencing the d-file, and prepares for a potential regrouping if the central tension escalates or shifts. The move also signals an intent to consolidate the position, perhaps anticipating white's further pawn thrusts on the queen side or a reassessment of the king side dynamics. Unlocking the king side is the goal here, preparing for a potential pawn storm. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm, black immediately challenges white's central structure and aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces, creating dynamic imbalances and forcing a strategic reevaluation. Shifting the queen to d2 now aims to solidify the king side, preparing for a potential king side attack by unpinning the f-pawn and allowing for the eventual repositioning of other pieces, perhaps even a knight sortie to g4. Unlocking the queen side, this ambitious pawn thrust forcefully tears open a new avenue for the queen and rook, challenging white's central control and threatening to disrupt the solid structure. It's a calculated risk, transforming the battlefield into a more dynamic, potentially volatile, zone where tactical opportunities might bloom, but also exposing lines that could be exploited if black isn't perfectly positioned for the ensuing complications. Unleashing the knight from its initial constraint on a1 finally brings white's cavalry into the fray, directly challenging black's pawn structure, and opening a diagonal for the queen on d2 that was previously somewhat obstructed. Suddenly, the board explodes as black injects radical dynamism into the game, challenging white's central pawns head-on. This aggressive pawn thrust isn't merely about opening lines. It's a calculated gamble to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and exploit potential overextension on the queen side. Black's pieces, particularly the knight on d7, now find new avenues for activity, potentially aiming towards the exposed white king's flank. White must react with precision, as a misstep could lead to a swift collapse of their seemingly solid structure. The central tension is now at its peak. Opening the central d-file abruptly, the exchange of pawns immediately creates tactical possibilities and introduces a dynamic element into what was a relatively closed position, forcing black to decide whether to embrace the ensuing complications or seek a more solid defense. Liberating the central pawns and opening the long diagonal for the queen, this recapture initiates a dynamic struggle for central control. Liberating the knight from its restricted posting opens up immediate central control and a dynamic pawn advance, forcing black to acknowledge the shift in pawn structure and the new attacking potential on the king side. Releasing the central tension creates a dynamic pawn structure, where black's queenside presence becomes more pronounced against white's somewhat passive development. Unleashing a tactical storm, this pawn advance rips open the king's defenses, creating immediate attacking possibilities down the e-file. Grasping for breathing room, this knight dives into the white-controlled central territory, seeking tactical disruption. Sacrificing the bishop on e4 dramatically alters the pawn structure, opening a diagonal for your queen while creating a passed d-pawn for black. opening the diagonal for the queen to potentially infiltrate, while simultaneously challenging white's central pawn structure. Exploiting the weakened dark squares on black's kingside becomes paramount with this bishop repositioning. It eyes the crucial h7 diagonal and prepares to potentially join an attack that was momentarily stalled. Securing the open file with the rook immediately solidifies control, a crucial step in preparing for potential exchanges and improving piece coordination towards the center. Unleashing a potent pawn thrust, white dramatically alters the central landscape, creating immediate threats against black's beleaguered monarch and aiming to pry open lines for swift exploitation. The capture on e6 decisively opens the f-file for black's rook, creating immediate attacking potential towards white's king, while simultaneously relieving the pressure on the d5 pawn and setting up for a potential counteroffensive. Unlocking the c-file becomes a primary objective after this repositioning, aiming to exploit the lingering weakness on the queenside created by black's pawn structure. Shifting the knight to e5 dynamically opens up black's central control, aiming to exploit white's potentially exposed d-pawn and challenge the control of the d-file. Unleashing the knight from its cramped post on a1, this maneuver aims to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's pawn structure and control key central squares, setting the stage for a potential pawn storm or piece activity. Reclaiming the queenside initiative is paramount here. The knight on e3 is a potent threat, and rerouting the queen to b5 aims to contest the open b-file and potentially create counterplay against white's somewhat exposed king. Sacrificing the queen here opens up critical lines for your rooks and initiates a potentially decisive attack against black's exposed king, forcing a difficult defense. Exchanges are afoot, and by returning the rook, black aims to simplify while simultaneously pressuring white's central pawns and potentially opening lines towards the king. The rook's return to the open file immediately contests the crucial central highway, aiming to disrupt black's nascent pawn control and reclaim essential space after the recent exchanges. A bold attempt to reignite the kingside and potentially trap the white queen, though it might overextend the bishop. Unleashing the queen to that diagonal immediately targets the vulnerable black king, forcing a difficult decision and potentially opening lines for further attack. Forcing white's king into a precarious central position is the immediate tactical advantage, potentially unraveling their defensive structure. The king steps back, a moment of tactical breathing room as the queen is forced to reposition, but this retreat may well expose the monarch to further threats later in the game, particularly with the open files and black's active pieces. The relentless pressure on the black king is intensifying. QH5 offers a temporary reprieve and aims to disrupt white's pieces, potentially creating counterplay through the h-file, though it might also expose the queen to white's centralized forces. Activating the rook on the 5th rank finally addresses white's awkward piece placement and initiates a bid for counterplay, aiming to disrupt black's growing control. A brilliant lightning bolt in the storm. This knight's sacrifice unleashes a furious attack, directly exposing the white king's precarious position and forcing a painful choice that will dictate the game's immediate future.